Hi everyone! Today we are going to talk about bulk fermentation. I feel like bulk fermentation is the root cause of many problems people have with sourdough, and I will give you 10 tips. I'm not going to call them rules because I don't like that expression when it comes to sourdough, but 10 tips to help you decide if your dough has finished the bulk fermentation, because I think it can be quite difficult to tell, especially if you are just at the beginning of your sourdough journey. And I feel a lot of the problems people have with sourdough really stems from cutting the bulk fermentation short or letting it go for too long. I think people usually have a problem to under-ferment their loaves. I think everyone is so scared of overproofing the dough that they end up cutting the bulk fermentation too early. I know that's what I did in the beginning when I was starting with sourdough. So I will try to use simple terms, I'll try to be practical. We won't use any charts, we won't need any thermometers to temp our dough, although that are the things that I understand some people like to do, and maybe if you have a micro bakery or something like that and you want very predictable results, you can absolutely go ahead and do that. But just for a regular home baker, there are some cues that you can look for, and we'll go over 10 of them today. So the first thing to understand about bulk fermentation is that temperature is by far the most important factor when it comes to determining if the bulk fermentation is done or not. So the temperature of your kitchen will be the main contributing factor to fermentation. That means in the summer, when your kitchen is probably a bit hotter, your dough will ferment quicker than in the winter, when I guess you have a colder kitchen. And it's not a small difference. I feel like in the summer, sometimes my dough ferments in 3 to 4 hours. And in the winter, I can have no problem leaving it overnight. So it can be quite a difference. And when you look at sourdough recipes, they usually call for bulk fermentation around 6 to 8, maybe 10 hours. Those are very approximate numbers, so the temperature will be the one to really tell you how much longer or how much shorter you need to go, along with other things we will go through as well. The second thing that will affect your bulk fermentation is the amount of starter used in a recipe. So usually recipes call for about 20% of starter in relation to flour, and if you use that much, you have a standard sourdough recipe with bulk fermentation predicted to last, like I said, around 6 to 8 or maybe 10 hours. But the thing is that a lot of recipes use more or less starter. So if you're using less starter, your dough will ferment more slowly, and if you use more, your dough will ferment quicker. While we're on the topic of the amount of starter in the recipe, that's actually my favorite way to manipulate bulk fermentation time, because in the winter, if you want your bread to rise quicker, you can simply use more starter, or in the summer you can use a bit less to prevent over fermentation if you don't want it to be done in 3 or 4 hours. It's much easier than getting your kitchen to become a lot more warm or a lot more cool. The third thing to be conscious about when we talk about bulk fermentation is the hydration of the dough. This might sound complicated, but hydration basically means how much water is used in the recipe in relation to flour. So if the dough is very sticky, very wet, a bit difficult to handle, that means you're handling a high hydration dough. And high hydration doughs ferment a lot more quicker than low hydration doughs. So for example, if you're baking a plain sourdough artisan bread, it will be higher in hydration than if you are baking, for example, a brioche. So without complicating too much, because we definitely could when it comes to hydration in relation to bulk fermentation, we will just say that high hydration doughs usually ferment faster than low hydration doughs, and this is something to keep in mind when you're baking. So just to sum up, the first 3 things that affect bulk fermentation the most are temperature, the amount of starter used in the dough, and the amount of water used in the dough. And now we're really getting to the point of this video, which is some practical cues that you can use to decide if your dough is done bulk fermenting. A very obvious cue is bubbles on the surface of the dough. And if you're using glass bowl for your dough to do the bulk fermentation in, you can also see that even all around the bowl and on the bottom of the bowl, small bubbles will be visible. Now, I don't like that cue as much as some people do, because I find that after 2, 3 or 4 hours, there will already be lots of bubbles, but that doesn't mean the dough is done bulk fermenting. That just means that it's fermenting nicely. But you can definitely check for the amount of bubbles. You want a lot of bubbles at the end of bulk fermentation, especially on the surface of the dough, and you can make your job easier and do bulk fermentation in glass bowls, so you'll be able to see all the bubbles around and also on the bottom. For the fifth cue, some people like to refer to it as the jiggle test, and you basically take the bowl that your dough is bulk fermenting in and you shake it a little and you see if the dough jiggles. You can also do that once your dough is already out of the bowl, maybe even pre-shaped on a surface. If it jiggles nicely, it means that it's nicely fermented. Now, again, this cue is quite affected by the hydration of the dough, so by how much water is used in the dough. Because if the dough is really stiff, like for bagels, for example, or some kind of brioche dough, it naturally won't be as jiggly as plain bread dough. So take it with a grain of salt, but you can definitely do the jiggle test for no other reason, because it's fun. The sixth cue is to watch the surface of your dough and determine if it's sticky or if it became kind of smooth and only a bit tacky. In the early stages of fermentation, your dough will be shaggy and sticky, and if you will touch it with your finger, it will definitely stick to it. But later, as the fermentation progresses, it will become smooth, and although it will be kind of sticky still, if you wet your finger a little bit or flour it a little bit and then touch the surface of your dough, the dough really shouldn't stick to it anymore. That's actually one of my favorite cues to look for, especially combined with the seventh cue, which is sometimes called a finger dent test. Now, the finger dent test is pretty much what the name says it is. You poke your finger into the dough and you watch what happens next. So if you gently press your finger onto the dough and then remove it, the dough should really slowly spring back, but not entirely. So a little dent should be visible even after you poke it gently. If it's not, it usually means it's under-fermented, so you have to leave it to ferment a bit longer. And if it doesn't spring back at all, it means it's past the full fermentation already and you have over-fermented dough on hand. And in that case, maybe it's best to make focaccia or something like that. But when the dough is nicely fermented, when you poke it, the dent should spring back, but not entirely. Cue number 8 is the domed shape of the dough. So you can check for that when the dough is still in the bowl. If you look at it from the side, you should be able to see that there's a slight dome to it. So I'm having a hard time finding the words to explain this very well, so I'll just show you the video in the background. But basically, you don't want your dough to just be flat on the surface, but you want it to have a bit of a dome. That again depends on the hydration of the dough as well. If the dough is very hydrated, it won't have as much dome, but it should really have a little bit. Cue number 9 is the pull away test. So what we're testing here is if the dough pulls away from the sides of your bowl nicely. Now, usually it won't come off really nicely, but it shouldn't stick to it very much. So if you wet your fingers or maybe flour them a little bit and you gently try to pull the dough from the sides of the bowl, it should slowly come off. And the last cue, cue number 10, is that the dough should come out of the bowl where you're doing your bulk fermentation nicely. So it shouldn't tear, it shouldn't stick too much when you move it from the bowl to the counter, and there shouldn't be much left in the bowl after you do that. The thing is, when the dough is fully fermented, it should come out of the bowl easily after bulk fermentation. I usually just take it out, kind of scoop it out, but for the purpose of this video, I tried to turn the bowl over and see if it will come out smoothly, and it did when it was nicely fermented. So if the dough sticks to the bowl when you try to do that, that's the indication that it's either under-fermented or over-fermented. I think that's it. I think that's all you need to know if you're starting with sourdough. We could complicate each of those cues further, but I think the major takeaways from this video are that temperature, the amount of starter, and the amount of water are probably factors that contribute the most to when you should end your bulk fermentation. I think the easiest things to do are to look for lots of bubbles, maybe do a jiggle test if the dough is jiggly and puffy. Look at the surface and decide if there's a dome to it. Test the stickiness of your dough. Try to press your finger into the dough and see if it springs back but not entirely. Try to gently pull your dough away from the sides of your bowl and see if it comes out of the bowl easily when you dump it onto the counter. And maybe just a final tip from my own observations. Like I said in the beginning, I think people tend to under-ferment their loaves in fear of over-fermenting them. I have a speedy sourdough recipe on my blog, and it's by far the most popular recipe. It's very popular with beginner bakers. It has high success rate, and I think the reason for that, and I was thinking about it a lot because I had no idea why this recipe worked for so many people while many others didn't. And the thing is, in this speedy sourdough recipe, I'm using a large amount of starter that's intended to speed up the fermentation. And the fermentation time for that recipe, if I remember correctly, is I think 3 to 4 hours. And people have no problem leaving the dough alone for 3 to 4 hours. And since there's a lot of starter in the dough, it ferments quickly. And it's usually really done fermenting after 3 to 4 hours. But when the recipe calls for 8-hour fermentation or 10-hour fermentation or even an overnight fermentation, people are constantly checking it. They are a little concerned that they will over-ferment it, and they usually cut the bulk fermentation short, and that leaves them with an under-fermented loaf. So I think if you're starting with sourdough and if you're in doubt anytime about whether bulk fermentation is done or not, I vote for leave it a bit longer. I think that way you will have more success than to cut it short just because you are so afraid you will over-ferment it. And just my personal opinion is that over-fermented loaf is still more tasty than under-fermented one. And if it's really over-fermented, you can still make focaccia and it will be great. But with under-fermented loaf or under-fermented dough, nothing will taste great if it's under-fermented. So it's definitely edible, but not ideal. I will choose over-fermented bread over under-fermented anytime. So that's it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions. I will gladly answer them. And next time you're doing bulk fermentation and wondering if it's done or not, just look for the cues we talked about and keep in mind that with changing seasons and maybe even the changes with your starter, bulk fermentation times will fluctuate, and that's completely okay. You will probably need to adjust your recipe throughout the year. Sourdough really keeps you on your toes, or so to speak. Let me know if you have any other dilemmas about sourdough, and I can do a video about that too. And I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!